It must have been a hard decision for God to make. I don't mean to suggest that anything is really hard for God to do, but rather that it's a decision that had consequences that even God could not have treated lightly. He would have had to give it very serious thought. I'm talking about the decision to put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. The question that we're addressing with that tree, and what I'm going to address today, is one that's bedeviled theologians and religious people for generation on top of generation on top of generation. And in one way, it's hard to understand why it is such a problem, but at the same time, there are reasons why we struggle with it. And I know commonly I'm asked, why was that tree even there? If God is going to, tells people they're not supposed to eat of it, well, then perhaps it would have been better if he just hadn't put it there in the first place. Now, I developed this theme at great length at the Feast of Tabernacles this last year in my final sermon. For those of you who didn't hear it, feel free to contact the office and ask for it. I think it's also a part of the Feast album that will be coming out this year, and I don't know if it's been offered yet, but it will be soon, in which I discussed at some length the question of why that tree was there. The conclusion I've come to is that it had to be there in order for man to have a choice. That if it had not been put there, then man would have wound up being nothing more than another specimen in a zoological, botanical garden for God's pleasure, so that he could come there and just enjoy. That man would have been like another creature of God's, like dogs or cats, who could only do what they were programmed to do, that had no choice, ultimately, in whether to do good or whether to do evil. But in the process of putting that tree there, God created a gate out of the Garden of Eden, if man wanted to take it, into a different kind of world, and he gave man a choice about the kind of a world he would live in. And one of the things that seems to be clear is that it was God's will for man to have a choice. God was, in that regard at least, pro-choice. God told the man not to eat of the tree, but left him free to eat it anyway. There's a lot contained in these two simple facts. One, God told him not to eat it, and second, God left him free to eat it. Keep that in mind. There's a lot in there that answers a lot of questions that people have had about so many things regarding the Bible, God's will, God's purpose. God told him don't do it, but left him free to do it. In order for God to achieve his objective, it was necessary that man be free. But that idea, the idea of freedom, has terrible consequences that have to be realized and have to be thought about. If man is not free to do evil, he's not free. If you're not free to do bad things, you're not free. If he's not free to hurt other people, he's not free. If we're going to associate with people, and if we're not free to hurt those people that we associate with, then we're not free. If man is not free to suffer, then he's not free. If the innocent are not free to suffer, then they are not free. The idea of freedom and of liberty has consequences that many people really do not seem to want to grapple with. They want to have the freedom. At the same time, they want to ask themselves, well, why do these things happen? Why do innocent people get hurt? Why are these things allowed in God's good world if God is good? The answer is, God is good. Man is free. And if you're not free to do evil, you're not free. It would have been possible for God to create a world where men would never harm innocent children. But that world would not have been free. In order to be free ourselves, we must be free to suffer the consequences of the choices of other people. Because most of the suffering, in fact, virtually, I guess all the suffering in the world, except what's self-inflicted, is inflicted because we are suffering the free choices that other people are making. A burglar makes a choice to burgle your house. You suffer the loss of your goods or your property because of a choice he made that he didn't have to make. But he was free to make that choice. If he hadn't been free to make it, he's not free at all. And if you hadn't been free to suffer it, you wouldn't be free at all. And so it goes with the choices of all kinds of people. Every intervention of God in the affairs of men, and he does intervene, But every intervention of God in the affairs of men is an abridgment of the freedom he intended for man. If you pray and ask God to help you find a job, God, if he does so, will abridge the freedom of the person who finally decides to give you the job, who might not have given it to you had God not somehow stepped in and changed the choices that this person was going to make. If he wasn't free to choose someone other than you, God abridged his freedom. Now, I believe that God does do that, but I do not believe that he does it that frequently, and I certainly think that his only time he does it is on the request of someone whose request he has decided to honor. In order to put food on the table of your hungry children that you didn't otherwise have, God may have to abridge your freedom to be poor. If God actually intervenes, if he has to do something to give food to your children that you otherwise could not provide, he is abridging your freedom to be poor and hungry. It's a freedom that you have. It comes right along with your freedom not to work. It comes right along with your freedom to be feckless in the use of your funds. It comes right along with the freedom to overcharge your credit cards and run them over the limits to where you can't afford things that you need to buy for your children anymore. All these freedoms are ours. We can do what we wish. And God says you are free to suffer the consequences of your decision as well. Man is deeply conflicted about freedom. It's okay at a certain level, but we will lay it down at a heartbeat once it becomes too hard to bear, once it becomes painful, once it becomes too frustrating. If someone comes along who will take away our freedom but will give us food and shelter and clothing, sometimes we will accept that loss of freedom, and we'll actually accept slavery in order to fill our empty bellies and to give us safety from someone that otherwise might be threatening us, or whatever it is that we're willing to lay down our freedoms for. History is full of it. It happens again and again and again. And so in his law, God made provision for the renewal of freedom after it had been laid down. I want you to turn back to Leviticus 25 to an interesting law. I don't think one that's terribly well understood, because I don't think it can be terribly well understood, because we live in a totally different society, a totally different world, and a totally different economy. We can't observe these laws in the letter for a couple of reasons. One, we don't know when the Jubilee is, and therefore we really can't, all of us, decide, well, we're going to keep this law together, and every 7 years we'll let our land lie fallow as they did in those days, because, A, we don't know when it was. Second, we don't live in the Israelite community, which is another way of saying that we don't live under their particular covenant and deal with God. The Old Covenant being a particular way of applying the law of God to a community. In other words, the Old Covenant was an administration of the law of God. It's confusing to people because they like to say, well, the Old Covenant was the law. No, the Old Covenant was the law as applied into the circumstance by this administration. And in that administration, that particular way of doing things is no longer open to us. For another thing, our land has not been given to us by lot, and you're going to see shortly why that would be a problem and why we can't. But we can obey the spirit of the laws, and we can learn from the principles that the laws demonstrate. Leviticus 25. The Lord spoke to Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in the fruit. In the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath of rest to the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You're not going to sow your field. You're not to prune your vineyard. You just let her grow. Whatever comes up, comes up. That which grows of its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap. You shall not gather the grapes of your vineyard. It's a year of rest to the Lord." Basically what he means by that is you don't go out there and go through the whole rigmarole of making your crop, doing all that work, getting all of it ready, getting your grapes, making wine. Don't do that, God says. It's not only a year of rest to the Lord, it's a year of rest to you. And I think some farmers could probably appreciate in some ways what this would mean to them, provided they could survive if they did this. And that is that it would give them a year in which they could do the work of fixing fences, repairing barns, taking care of things that they'd had to neglect before, because farming is hard work. Farming is, what they say, you farm until in the morning, from you can until you can't at night. It's can to can't. It's whenever you just have to keep after it and keep after it and keep after it. And farmers of all people would appreciate the Sabbath day because, frankly, if God didn't tell them, lay down your tools and rest, they'd probably work themselves to death, as not a few farmers, I think, down through generations have actually done in order to survive with their families. Well, this is to be not merely a weekly Sabbath. This is to be a land Sabbath, 1 year in 7 that the land was allowed to lie idle. The Sabbath of the land shall be food for you, for your servant, your maid, your hired servant, and the stranger that sojourns among you. In other words, anybody and everybody can go out there and gather enough out of your fields for a meal, including you. You just don't harvest it. You don't put it together for sale. You don't get a crop. You don't gather up baskets of grape and take them down to the market. We don't do that. You can go out and get them. You can eat them. You can gather for wheat. You can make a loaf of bread for your family, but you don't market it. Okay? The stranger, the fatherless, the poor, the downtrodden, your family, your servants that work for you all the time can go out there and help themselves, but it's for food. It's for your cattle and for the beast in your land and all the increase thereof for meat. And then he says this, you shall number 7 Sabbaths of years to you, 7 times 7 years. The space of 7 Sabbaths of years shall come to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. Interestingly, that's the Day of Atonement, when the trumpet of the Jubilee is sounded. You shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. It's interesting because the word Pentecost means 50th. And so consequently, in a sense, the Jubilee year is also the Pentecost, or the 50th year. You shall proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee to you. You shall return every man to his possession. You shall return every man to his family. Now, what happened in these days was the land had originally been divided by lot to the children of Israel. And our land wasn't divided that way to us. We had to go out and buy it and pay it off if we had done so. But it's different for them. That land was divided by lot. It belonged to the Lord. They didn't own it freehold, as they would say. They owned it by virtue of God's gift to their family. And that land was handed down generation by generation through the family. You could sell it, but you could only sell it to the Jubilee. You did not hold it freehold. It was leasehold, as it were. They would call it in England. In England, a great deal of the land there is leasehold. It is not freehold. It's owned by the crown. And you can purchase it from a person, but you only purchase the lease, and you do not actually own the property. You own it until a certain period of time has passed, and then it reverts back to the crown again. And the price of the land is determined by the time before it actually reverts back to the crown. Well, in this case, that was the same thing was true. If you were to buy a property from a man in the 25th year of a 50-year cycle, you paid him the value of a 25-year lease on that property. You did not own that property outright to do whatever you wanted to do with it at the end of the 50 years. So you could work with it through that period of time. It was yours to work with. At the end of 50 years, the trumpet was sounded, and at that moment of time, all that property reverted back to the original families and to whoever the birthright guy was, that would have been handed down to from father to son to son to son to son, down through all their generations. You could have waxed poor about year 40. You could have gotten yourself in so much trouble you could never get out of it, and sold off everything you had and still couldn't do it, and sold the land and impoverished yourself. 10 years later, when the trumpet of the Jubilee was blown, that land was yours again. Now, this is interesting because he says you proclaim a liberty throughout the land. That marvelous word that's so important to us as Americans, liberty, freedom, that you proclaim this liberty. That means that all the stupid things we did that got us into trouble are all wiped off the table. All of our economic stupidity, all of our failures, and all of that type of stuff are gone. Now it comes back to us. We are supposed to go back to our property, back to our family, back to our lands, back to where we belong. That we actually have a place on the face of this earth where we and our family and all of us belong, and in the Jubilee we have the right to go back to it. He says, a Jubilee shall that 50th year be to you. You shall not sow nor reap that which grows in itself, nor gather the grapes or the vine undressed. It is the Jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. In the year of this Jubilee you shall return every man to his possession. If you sell aught to your neighbor or buy anything of your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. You shall not try to maintain control of that property beyond this point. And he goes on to describe to you how year after year you are supposed to reckon the sale of the property depending upon how many years there are left to the Jubilee. You shall not therefore oppress one another. Notice twice now he's used this term oppression. That one of the problems we get into in our lives because of poor management, poor thought, bad habits, whatever it is we do, is we get ourselves into the position to where we are oppressed. It is oppression to hold on to a man's property beyond, as God says, this period of time. But a man becomes oppressed because of the stupid things he does. The law of God made provision, for example, that if you, in your want or whatever it was you had, you went out and stole a sheep, and they caught you. If you had the sheep, you had to restore that one, and what was it? I forget the exact details. It was one more, and in some cases it was 4 for 1. In some cases it was more than that, depending on whether the sheep was alive or dead. What did they do with you if you didn't have anything? And generally speaking, people who went out and stole a sheep didn't have, we're not going to have 4 to give back, right? So what are you supposed to do? Well, they took you down to the auction block, put you up on the auction block, and they sold your work until the next period of time, whenever, whatever period of time it was you're going to have to go out. One of the things it's talking about when it talks about proclaiming a liberty in the land is that the maximum sentence in Israel for any kind of crime like this was 6 years. Because at the end of the 6th year, every 6 years, a liberty was proclaimed on the 10th day of the 7th month, and all the prisoners were let go. All those people who had been sold, all those people who were slaves, all were let go. And of course the Jubilee is a time when everyone is going to be let go. Everybody gets to go back home to their land. And he says in verse 23, the land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me. Now that's an interesting idea right there. That God makes this very clear. He says you don't do this forever, and you shouldn't treat any of this stuff as though it really belongs to you, because the land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners with me. And of course, throughout the Bible, God repeatedly tells Israel, I want you to think very carefully about this, because you're strangers and sojourners with me, and you'd better be careful how you treat the people who are strangers and sojourners with you. Realizing that just as I am treating you, you need to be careful to treat those people well as well. Now, there's an interesting illustration or example of these laws in the book of Jeremiah. You'll find it back in chapter 34. It's not entirely clear in reading through this section what happened, what all the details were. But in Jeremiah chapter 34, verse 8, it says, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people that were at Jerusalem to proclaim liberty to them. We came to a point in time where King Zedekiah agreed, and all the nobles and princes also agreed. In fact, they all went into a covenant that every man should let his manservant and his maidservant be as a Hebrew or a Hebrewess go free. They could maintain their servants who were not Hebrews. But if they were Hebrews, they had to be let go free, and that no one should serve himself of them, to wit, of a Jew, his brother. Now, when all the princes and the people had entered into this covenant, heard that every one should let his manservant and his maidservant go free, that no one should serve themselves of them anymore, they obeyed and they let them go. I would presume we're at a time, of the freeing. It's the normal annual or 7-year cycle of freeing people out of servitude. Afterward, though, they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free to return, and brought them into subjection for servants and handmaids. Now, this is really interesting, because you have to ask yourself, how on earth could this work? First of all, we released them. I presume there would be documents that had to do with how long a person was to serve. They were, I don't know if it's like indentured servants, but they were actually contracted servants. They had periods of time in which they were to serve. These contracts were all null and void. Everybody was let go. Out they went. Now, very shortly after this, how long we aren't exactly told, but they're out there making these same people servants and handmaids again. Did they do it by force? Did they go out there and with armed soldiers and get them and drag them back? Perhaps they did. Anyway, it says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, saying, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, saying, at the end of 7 years let you go every man his brother a Hebrew, which has been sold to you. When he has served 6 years, you shall let him go free from you. But your fathers wouldn't listen, and they wouldn't incline their ears. They were continuing to oppress people. And you were now turned and had done right in my eyes in proclaiming liberty, everyone to his neighbor. For years and years this was not done. And finally you people made the change. Finally you people were willing to grant liberty to people. Now mind you, the people who were in slavery were there for a reason. They were oftentimes miscreants. They had done stupid things. They had been criminals. They had gone into debt. They had done all sorts of things that had led to them being made slaves in the first place. We're not talking, by the way, about conquered countries. We're talking about people of their own country who had become indentured or, more than that, servants. Okay, so they were bondservants to these people. He says, finally, at long last, you decided you'd obey me. And the 7th year came along. We blew the trumpet. You let them all go free. But you turned and polluted my name and caused every man his servant, every man his handmaid, whom he had set at liberty at their pleasure, to return, and brought them into subjection to be for you servants and for handmaids. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, you have not listened to me in proclaiming liberty, every one his brother, every man to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim a liberty for you, saith the Lord, to the sword and to the pestilence and to the famine, and I will make you be removed unto all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, that's a funny expression, isn't it? I will make a liberty for you to the sword and the pestilence and the famine. But you got to understand something. What God is saying here is, you want liberty for yourself? I'll proclaim liberty. I'll take my hands off. And then you will have the sword, the pestilence, and the famine. The reason why we have so many terrible things in our lives is because we have made choices that have brought them our way. We have made choices that have taken us out of the road that God put us in to walk. We have made choices that have brought bad things upon us. Our own sins have caused these things to come upon us. We have exercised our freedom. And if you want freedom, God says, if you want liberty, says God, I will proclaim liberty. And this is part of the liberty. This is part of what you've got to endure. This is what goes with your freedom. When you sin, these things come back on you again. You made these people servants again. I'm going to make you servants in another place at another time. Now, freedom is a terrible burden to be borne. And I don't know how we can tell the circumstances entirely of what happened in Jeremiah's day to these people. I do believe that some people who, having been freed from servitude, want to go back. There are men who are out of jail, who are not comfortable out of jail, and who actually have gone out and committed crimes in order to get back into jail where they were comfortable before, where they were fed, where they were clothed, where they knew what the routine was, and they knew how to live. They have become so institutionalized, they can't live really very well outside. And so they go and do the same things they did before, and back inside they go again. There are some people who want to be in that type. They want to be taken care of. They want to lay their freedom down. They want to be slaves. They want to be servants. They want someone else to take care of them. Because freedom is a terrible burden to be borne. I know it must be, because we complain about it so much. What do I mean by that? We complain about our freedoms? Oh, we complain about them all the time. We say, why does God allow war? That's a complaint about our freedom. Why does he allow innocent children to suffer? That's a complaint about our freedom. Why did God allow the Holocaust? Well, that's a complaint against our freedom. We have the freedom to do. We have the freedom to do. We have the freedom to hurt. We have the freedom to harm. And if we have it, so do other people. And if other people have that freedom, we have the freedom to suffer from what they do. Freedom is the word. It's a terrible word. It's a frightening word. It's a dangerous word. We need to understand. It is the freedom of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You do know, don't you, that the way the Bible uses the word knowledge in that sense is in the sense of to know it, in the sense of to experience it. That they made the choice of experiencing good and evil, and we have been doing it ever since. Man was told what to do and left free not to do it. He was told what not to do and left free to do it anyway. That's what freedom is. But we want selective freedom. We want to be free to do what we want to do, but not free enough to experience the consequences of what we have done. Now, I think that's a fair thing to say, don't you? Don't you think it's fair to say that we would really like to be free to do whatever we want to do, but not free enough to avoid the consequences for the things that we do. The bad consequences. Good consequences, that's okay. And the irony of it all is that as we exercise our freedom to choose, what we choose leads us back into bondage again and again and again. And this is why, in His original law, God made provision for re-freeing people, for freeing them again. And I have very little doubt that there were some people back in those ancient times, if they followed this prescription during very long at all, who would have been in and out of bondage 7 or 8 times in a lifetime, depending on how long they lived. That they would have been in, they would have got to the 6th year, got released at the beginning of the 7th year, and some of them would have been back in again by the time the 2nd year of that cycle went around, and the 3rd and the 4th, they're back in slavery again. That people were in and out, just like today people are in and out of prison all the time. There are some people who can't seem to keep their life, and there's some people who ought to be there who aren't. Well, where this is takes us into bondage again and again. There was a day early in Jesus' ministry when He showed up in a synagogue. It's an interesting day. This is the first time, I think, that He really begins to preach, and we begin to find out what Jesus is all about. It's in Luke chapter 4 and verse 14. Not very long after His temptation with Satan. And Jesus returned in the power of Spirit into Galilee. Luke 4:14. And there went a fame of Him throughout all the region round about, and He taught in their synagogues, being glorified by everybody. Everybody really admired Him. He came to Nazareth, where He had been brought up. And as His custom was, He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. And there was delivered to Him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when He had opened the book, He found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." Now, you do understand, don't you? This is a very clear reference back to Leviticus 25. He said, "I'm here to set at liberty the captives, to loose those that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And He sat down and closed the book, gave it to the minister, and sat down. Everybody was looking at Him. He began to say to them, "This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." Now, I don't know if you understand the significance of this, but if we can just understand how easy it is for man to lay down the burdens of freedom, how easy it is for us to enslave ourselves to other men, to sin, to habits, to the world, to the things that we live in the world. And you come to understand that the releasing of captives is no simple matter, that the rescuing of people who are in that thing is no simple matter. You begin to understand that Jesus, as Savior, is the one who came to bridge that gap that we crossed, that Adam and Eve crossed, when they took of the knowledge of the tree of evil, went out of the Garden of Eden, were barred from paradise, were barred from the tree of life. That Jesus is the one who came to preach the acceptable year of the Lord, the deliverance of the captives, the freeing of those that were bound in sin, by other men, by whatever it is that their own stupidity and their own cupidity had finally got them into. Jesus is the one to preach this. Now, this prophecy came from Isaiah chapter 61. I want to go back there, if you would, verse 1, because it is extremely important. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of the vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn, to appoint to them that mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. All the weight of the world that sits on our shoulders, He has come to take away. And they shall rebuild the old wastes. They shall raise up the former desolations. They shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations. Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. The sons of the alien shall be your vinemen, your plowmen, but you shall be named the priests of the Lord." Jesus was the one who was to do this. Later it says, "I will greatly rejoice," in verse 10, "in the Lord. My soul shall be joyful in my God, for He has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decks himself with ornaments, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels." Jesus Himself was one who took upon himself the garment of salvation with the burden that came with that garment. Sometimes I wonder if people really realize that salvation, people talk about save, you see it on the side of barns, Jesus saves, and they talk about salvation all the time, but sometimes I really wonder if they understand that salvation is the rescue of a people who have lost their freedom because of choices that they have made. Inevitably, as we live through life, we're going to make choices that are going to bring all kinds of bad stuff upon us, and we need to be saved from that bad choice. But we also sometimes, I think, don't realize is that salvation is not without cost. If you turn back to Hebrews, the 2nd chapter, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, the writer of Hebrews says, "We see Jesus, who is made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. For it became him by whom are all things, and for whom are all things, by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. For both he that sanctified and he that sanctifies them are all of one, for which sake he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the church I will sing praise to you. And again I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I am the children which God has given me. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that has the power of death, that is, the devil." And there's a fascinating, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, a comparison, shall we say, between the fact that you and I live in a world where we get to make choices and are subject to the choices of other people. I mean, if you decide to hurt me, you can hurt me. If you decide to steal from me, you can steal from me. And if you decide to kill someone, you can do it. You can actually, there's not much to keep you from it. If you hang around with your rifle somewhere, you can actually kill somebody. We are all vulnerable in this world to one another. And I don't know if people think about it this way or not, but that being the case, it was necessary that Jesus also make himself vulnerable to the choices that men make. That he has to make himself vulnerable to the choices that human beings make. He came to deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, he took on him the nature of the seed of Abraham. He didn't make himself like an angel. He made himself like us. And he came and walked on this earth like us. And he got this freedom to make any choice that he chose to make as he walked on this planet. But because he was free, he was also subject to the choices that other human beings made every day. He dodged them a few times. He escaped out of their hands a few times. But then, one night, there came a time when he had to submit himself to the decisions that other people were going to make about him, that were going to cost him his life, his dignity, were going to cost him his comfort, were going to cause him great pain, humiliation, anguish, betrayal. He had to submit himself to the choice that Judas made to sell him out. He had to submit himself to men who were going to mock him and humiliate him and make fun of him. He had to submit himself to the choices of men who'd cram a crown of thorns down on his head. He had to submit himself to men who would slap him around the face and pull the cheeks of the beard off his face. He had to submit himself, whose choices led them to drag him out to Golgotha, having scourged him, and to crucify him and leave him hanging in the sun to die. These decisions were all made by human beings who made choices to kill the Son of God. And because of our freedom to suffer, he took upon himself the freedom to suffer as well. Isaiah 53 goes along this line. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, like a root out of dry ground. He has no form, no comeliness. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, that is, with sickness and pain. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. But surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrow. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. It's a curious thing, but what seems to be said in Isaiah here is that the way man looks at what happened to Jesus is that, well, God just did it to him. Just one of those things. And it's a disconnect from us and from what we have done and from the choices that we have made. And yet it's very clear when you read through it that Jesus did not go where he was because of his choice to commit sin. He went where he was because of his choice to be like us, because of his choice to do the right thing, because of his choice to be faithful to God. But in the process, he had to submit himself to the choices that were made by evil and wicked men. Hebrews 4, verse 14. Seeing then we have a great high priest that has passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let's hold fast our profession. For we don't have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. He was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. He had all the choices before him that we make. He could have made any of the choices that we make. And he didn't make many of the choices that we make. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus voluntarily, because it had to be voluntary. It could mean nothing if God required it of him. He asked if it would pass, but he worked his way through that prayer that night to submit himself to God's will. And he told Pilate, I could speak the word and I have a legion of agents to get me out of here. You would have no power against me unless it were given to you by God. He had a choice right up until the last moment and didn't make it. Or he made the right choice, perhaps we should say. Freedom is highly problematical for us. If we are truly to be free, then other people are going to have to suffer because of the choices that we make. We need to think about that. Our freedom to choose means somebody, somewhere, can get hurt by the things that we do. If I'm not free to inflict pain on you, I'm not free. I have the choice to do it or not. If you're not free to experience that pain, then you're not free. And what Jesus faced in that long night of his betrayal was the voluntary subjection of himself to the evil choices of other men. And it's a small wonder, knowing what he was doing, that he sweat blood that night, asking that if there was some way they could do this thing without him going through that, let's do it. And he finally came to realize there was no other way, and so he made the choice. What does all that mean to us? Well, James said in his first chapter, verse 22, that we should be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving our own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholds himself, and he goes his way and forgets what kind of person he is. But whoever looks into the perfect law of liberty, think about that. The perfect law of liberty. And James makes it clear what he's talking about. He's talking about the Ten Commandments. He continues in that, not being a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work. This man shall be blessed in his deed. The law of God is called the law of liberty. And it's exemplified in the simple little lesson of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told him not to eat it, and God left him free to do it. It is that way with the entirety of God's law. He tells you, don't do that, and leaves you free to do it. He tells you, do this, and leaves you free not to do it. And that freedom, that liberty, is a terrible burden to be borne. And because we have borne it rather poorly in our lives, a lot of us are suffering in a lot of ways, even now. And if it weren't for Jesus Christ, who has bridged the way back for us, if it weren't for him making the choice to be like us and to accept the kind of choices, the evil choices that men made against him, we would be without hope, I think, in this world. But Jesus Christ has made the way back. You know, the law of God can never be a yoke of bondage. It's stupid of it to speak it that way, because man is always free to disobey and to enjoy the consequences of disobedience of God's law. Liberty carries with it great responsibility.